Shabbat Shalom. Perhaps the most important thing to say about the spring of 1967, 50 years ago, is just how different the world was then than it is today. The memory of the Holocaust, 6 million murdered at the hands of the Nazis, Jews, while the world stood by watching, was a wound still fresh. Israel was a mere 19 years old, a fledgling experiment in Jewish nationalism. There was no AIPAC. There was no birthright. There was no startup nation, no Gal Gadot. All that which we take for granted today regarding Israel's security, Israel's place on the world stage, the political muscle of American Jewry, none of that was the case in 1967. Today, we see a Middle East in disarray and at odds with itself, the continued ripple effect of the now 7-year-old Arab Spring or winter, depending on your point of view. In 1967, the Arab states were totally united in their hatred for the Zionist entity in their midst and their shared hope to drive the Jews into the Mediterranean. As for the movement for Palestinian liberation, remember, from 1949 through 1967, if the West Bank was occupied, then it was not by Israel, but by the Jordanians, who never once sought to establish a sovereign Palestinian state, nor for that matter did the Egyptians who controlled Gaza. Jerusalem was divided. Jewish holy sites were off limits to Jews. A vulnerable and isolated Jewish state in the very inhospitable neighborhood called the Middle East. Were it thus to have been the case that in the shadow of the Shoah, Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser made repeated genocidal calls for Israel's destruction, Dayenu, that would have been enough to provoke Israel to act in self-defense. So too, we might say, the repeated and increasingly deadly border incursions into Israel that spring, the ominous Egyptian and Syrian troop movements, buildups, or the flyovers over Israel's Dimona nuclear facility, all these aggressions, amongst others, rendering evident the belligerent intentions of Israel's enemies. And then, of course, the two precipitating events that would escalate the situation into a full-blown crisis. First, on May 19th, when Nasser expelled the UN peacekeeping force from the Sinai Peninsula, an eviction depriving the region of the one thing capable of diffusing the regional powder keg. Second, just a few days later, on May 22nd, Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran, blockading the Gulf of Aqaba from any shipment bound for the Israeli port of Eilat. With the Arab street whipped into an anti-Zionist frenzy, Israeli leadership looked understandably to their allies for support. Neither the British, nor the French, nor the Soviets, nor the Americans responded to Israel's foreign minister Abba Eban's repeated entreaties for support. The magnitude of the existential crisis took its toll on Israel's leadership. Yitzhak Rabin's nervous breakdown, Levi Eshkol's bumbling national address, and the infighting within a deeply frazzled cabinet. Israeli historians refer to these weeks as the Hamtana, the waiting, as the Israeli public bore witness to the rising tensions in an increasingly untenable position. Reserves were called up. Gas masks were hoarded, and in addition to the trenches, thousands of graves were dug in anticipation of the coming onslaught. Some here today may well remember these weeks leading to the outbreak of the Six-Day War 50 years ago this week. I encourage you to listen to the sermons delivered by Park Avenue's Rabbi Judah Nadich, Zichrono Livracha, on our website. We heard a clip last night. Sermons that capture the anxiety-ridden mood of the time. My parents, here this morning, were engaged to be married in London later that fall, and can clearly recall the desperate feeling of a Jewish people on the precipice of another Holocaust, a sentiment no doubt shared by all of world Jewry. The chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Emanuel Jakubowicz, called for an emergency solidarity rally to be held thousands at the Royal Albert Hall. The fate of the Jewish people hung in the balance, and all those in attendance were called on to do one of three things. First, if one could go to Israel and defend the Jewish state, then one must do so. Second, if one could not go, then one must make it one's obligation to ensure that the interests and affairs of those who were going would be tended to in their absence, their jobs, their businesses and livelihoods to be assured upon their return. Third, if one was not able to perform the first or the second task, then one must give of one's resources to support those efforts aimed at defending Israel in its hour of need. As it happens, the three professions most needed by Israel were truck drivers, anesthesiologists, and general surgeons. My father, a surgeon in attendance at the London rally, hopefully after consulting his fiancée, my mother, got on a plane from London to Israel. As the flight began its descent into Tel Aviv, 2 Israeli fighter jets escorted the plane to the airport. Abba Eben, it turns out, was on that same flight, returning from his diplomatic trips back to Israel, though my father continues to believe the Air Force escort was for him. Throughout the war, and in the weeks to follow, my father worked in Israeli hospitals, performing skin grafts, reconstructions, and other trauma-related surgeries at Tel HaShomer Hospital, meeting both Ben Gurion and Rabin as they visited the wounded soldiers. My mother soon followed, my parents just one of many stories of diaspora Jews who stepped up in Israel's dark hour. But my favorite part of the story is what would happen in the days following the war. Unlike this year, when the holiday of Shavuot is now in our rearview mirror, in '67, the Six-Day War immediately preceded the festival. My grandfather's dear friend, Rabbi Louis Rabinovitz, knowing my father had come to Israel, invited him to Jerusalem, explaining there was something he really needed to do. It was on that morning of June 15, 1967, just 6 days after the liberation of Jerusalem, that Rabbi Rabinowitz took my father into the Old City, winding through the narrow streets towards a newly liberated Kotel to celebrate Shavuot. Throughout the night, and with the rising of the sun, some 200,000 Jews, secular, religious, old and young, my father one of them, were able to do that which Jews had aspired to do for millennia, to visit our most sacred site, to dance, to pray, to sing with the Torah, with each other, as a sovereign Jewish nation. The dawn, literally and figuratively, of a new day. Our people, our capital, our Torah, unified, a breach in Jewish history mended, a tikkun, a mending, in the historical, geopolitical, and theological drama of our people. What a feeling it must have been for my folks to stand under the chuppah shortly thereafter, recalling Jerusalem by breaking a glass as do Jewish couples for millennia, only they were doing so with still fresh memories of having been in a united Jerusalem just a short while earlier. Friends, it is indeed true that the world in the spring of '67 was very, very different than the world as it is today. And it is because it is so very different that we must recall our history personally, proudly, and unapologetically. First and foremost, we must do so because in our Etch-a-Sketch era, where the retrieval of history is as fleeting as a Facebook feed, where Israel is labeled as a Goliath and not a David, our children and our children's children must understand that the aggressions of the Middle East did not begin with Israel, but with a hostile Middle East that repeatedly denied the right of Israel to exist. For the enemies of the Jewish people, the rewriting or denial of history is never a mere parlor game or intellectual exercise, but it is an ideologically driven effort to undercut our right to a Jewish national home. To recall the Six-Day War as a bellicose act by Israel in order to deny the Palestinian statehood is a telling both untrue and representative of a nefarious agenda to delegitimize Israel. There are those, writes David Harris of the AJC, who wish to rewrite history, who would have the world believe that were it not for Israel's settlement policy, peace would break out, swords would turn to plowshares, and lions would lie down with lambs. If nothing else, the occasion of 50 years since the Six-Day War serves as a wake-up call to all of us to spend the summer ahead, to spend the year and the years ahead committing to learning our history. For in that learning, we will find not only the truth, but find ourselves to be better advocates on behalf of the Jewish state. Second, and here let me tread carefully, we must know our history because we must know how very different the world is today than it was 50 years ago. Israel today is not the Israel of 1967, and that is exactly the point. The question of Israel's policies towards the settlements, towards nurturing a two-state solution, are questions whose answers lie in part, but not entirely, in Israel's hands. Like the biblical Samson, about whose origins we read this morning, Israel must be cautious lest it cause the edifice to tumble down upon itself. To insist on framing our present moment as akin to 67 is to do ourselves an intellectual and moral disservice in that it provides Israel a free pass on the manifold challenges presently on its docket. If we truly want our children and children's children to arrive 50 years from now with a hoped-for outcome for an Israel at peace with her neighbors, then Israel and the pro-Israel community must stop viewing the world through the prism of 67 or 38 or Masada or otherwise. On this, the eve of the 50-year anniversary of the outbreak of the 67 war, we must recommit ourselves to knowing our history. We must do so in order to remind ourselves of the justness of our cause. We must do so in order to remember the degree to which the solutions of our era must differ than those of times of past. Most of all, as Jews, we must know and tell our history because it is in the repeated engagement of our narrative that our story is transformed into memory. It is not enough to simply say the Exodus happened. Rather, every generation must see itself as if it departed from Egypt. It is not enough to say that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. As Jews, we make the claim that each and every one of us, all our souls, were present on that day. This is the secret sauce, if you will, of Jewish identity. That moment when our history, joyous or somber, calamitous or redemptive, becomes collective memory. For it is at that moment that we ourselves, each and every one of us, are written into the story of our people. On this, the anniversary of the Six-Day War, it is incumbent upon us to remember the facts, to be at home in our history, to make that history memory, and to weave ourselves into the eternal tapestry of our people. A final image. Yesterday morning, my daughter returned back from a semester in Jerusalem. This past Wednesday morning, at about 3:30 a.m., she and her friends walked to Jerusalem's Old City in order to celebrate the festival of Shavuot. As they neared the Jewish quarter, more and more people joined them, the crowd swelling with the first rays of sunlight. They arrived en masse at the Kotel, and it was there, at the egalitarian section of the wall, that my daughter chanted Torah, that she read from the book of Ruth, and in the midst of a mixed multitude of secular and religious Jews, felt joy and appreciation for the gift of being able to do that which Jews had longed to do for so many thousands of years, what my daughter's grandfather had done 50 years ago to the very moment. And so today, as son to my father and father to my daughter, knowing both of them are here in shul this morning, I thought of the golden sunrises they both experienced standing at the Kotel, and I wondered if the thought ever crossed my father's mind in '67 that one day a granddaughter of his would stand in that very spot 50 years henceforth. And I wondered if my daughter could imagine what it must have been like for her grandfather to have stood at that very spot on that historic Shavuot of liberation 50 years prior. And then I wondered further. I wondered if either of their ancestors could have ever imagined that their descendants one day would rejoice in Ir Asher Badad Yoshevet Uveliba Choma, in the solitary city in whose heart lies a wall, having suffered exile for thousands of years. And I smiled inwardly with pride at the thought of what these ancestors would have to say if they knew that my daughter stood at the Torah in her talit and equal in the eyes of God. And then finally, I wondered further. I wondered so much that I began to dream. Only now, no longer about the past, but about the future. I dreamt of a day, 50 years from now, when one of my grandchildren will stand at the Kotel in Jerusalem, an undisturbed Jerusalem, a Jewish people who after Mea Shanim Shel Cherev, 100 years of war, lives at peace with her neighbors. It is a day for which I dream, a day for which we all pray. It is a day for which we commit to working towards doing all in our power to make happen, no different than generations before. As diaspora Jews, we must always be ready to step up for Israel. That day, that golden sunrise signaling a new era, is not yet here. Like the Jerusalem of gold, its outline sits on the horizon just beyond our reach. And yet, in the darkness, its light still beckons. Distant as it is, it beckons us to draw near as we ever so slowly approach to greet the coming dawn. Shabbat Shalom.